Morning. It's about time for us to start on what's going to be a very exciting day together. A couple of announcements before I introduce our first speaker. Ginny Proctor, you've corresponded with her, is the registrar and the coordinator for this conference. She's setting up in the lobby. If you have questions related to your registration and other logistical matters, direct them to Ginny, if you will. And when you look at your schedule for today, there's an error. Session 4 this afternoon will be led by Kevin Siebold from Grove City College. It will begin at 1:30 and will go until 2:30, and then we'll have a 30-minute break prior to Session 5, which will be led by Dr. William Abraham. But other than that, we'll observe the schedule as it is printed. I want to assure you that we ordered good weather, and we expect it to arrive soon. Okay? In the meantime, our travels are limited. When you go to your workshops, it appears that most of them, if not all of them, are in what is called the Beeson Center. The Beeson Center is the building behind us, and it is connected to this building with a tunnel downstairs. So if you go out to the lobby and down the steps, you can walk through to the Beeson Center. Lunch will be in the Student Center, which is one building over, and then we'll meet there for dinner tonight and Jeff Schloss's keynote address in the Student Center. So for today, we'll be moving between these two buildings and the building next door, so you won't have to go out too much into the rain. It's a privilege for me to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ted Davis, who is Distinguished Professor of the History of Science at Messiah College in Grantham, Pennsylvania. I heard Ted speak several years ago at a Templeton conference in which he provided us with a very rich and insightful understanding of the historical context for this ongoing debate between today, the Bible and biology. It was very helpful, and at that point, we invited him to come and to be part of our project here at Asbury Seminary should we receive a grant, and we did. He's written extensively in the field of science and faith, studies the lives of scientists and their practice of faith, is a speaker who is internationally known for the work that he does. And we're very grateful that he has taken the time to come to be with us. So, Ted, please come and present for us.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. It sounds like I'm wired up, right? Well, you'll all think I'm wired up in a couple minutes. But I thank Mike and Mike Peterson for the opportunity to come and talk with you about the history of science and Christianity, aspects of that history of science and Christianity which are relevant to the themes of this conference. Let me just open with two little apologies. One, I have no printed notes. I have what you have in front of you, and I need to stand where I can see them. And so I'll stand either here or an equivalent place on the other side of the stage and talk to you from here so that I can see what I've got on the screen and you don't have to look at my back. The second point is that there's a couple of slides that might not come out too clearly on the screen. We had some challenges adjusting a projector, a digital projector. You can relate to, how these things go. And we've done what we can to get them as clear as possible. There may be a few that aren't quite as legible as maybe they ought to be. It's an issue of how bright certain colors are being projected. But you have the substance of my slides there. The images themselves are mostly the ones I'm going to show you that you probably haven't seen before, that don't come from the internet, are actually public domain images, cartoons drawn in the 1920s by Ernest James Pace, and his grandson has told me everything in there, all of those slides are public domain images. So you can find them in some of them in various places, or if you really want one to use yourself, you can let me know and I can try to get it sent to you. Okay, so let's start with the topic, the Bible and biology. What I'm going to try to do with you today is to go through three specific larger questions about this issue of the Bible and biology in the following order. I want to start with the question, why has evolution been so controversial among Christians? The second question, what do creation science and intelligent design claim about God, the Bible, and evolution? Now, I'm going to put those in the same part of the program, but as I'll make clear to you, I don't think they're the same thing, but I think there are some similarities that are relevant for our conversation. And the third question, which is perhaps the largest question, does the acceptance of evolution entail the denial of Orthodox Christianity? And of course, we could go on about that all day, and we'd have to define what we mean by that. So just so that we're on the same page in terms of what definition am I assuming for my purposes right now, I'm going to be assuming, for example, Orthodox Christianity as defined by the ecumenical creeds. That's what I'm going to be assuming. And so, now one could define it differently and then get into arguments about whether or not my conclusions are valid, and that's perfectly appropriate to have those differences of opinion. But I want to make sure everybody's clear on what I'm meaning when I'm talking about that. I'm just meaning the ecumenical creeds, the Apostles' and Nicene creeds. So let me go back to 1925 to begin our conversation. This very famous image posed for photographers at a show trial that took place in Dayton, Tennessee. A trial that happened as a direct result of a request that was made by the superintendent of schools in Rea County, Tennessee, to a first-year teacher, science teacher, who was substituting in the classes of the president in biology at the end of the year and reviewing for finals. The request was, would you be willing to teach evolution to challenge the constitutionality of a new law in Tennessee? And the teacher, John Scopes, sort of regarded this as an offer he couldn't refuse, and he did cooperate. He did agree to stand trial in the test case to challenge the constitutionality of the law. As I said, it was a show trial put up from the beginning deliberately. Everybody wanted a guilty verdict in order to be able to test the constitutionality of a law in higher courts. Now, you may not have known any of that, but I'm not going to be talking a lot about the Scopes trial here. I wanted to say the Scopes trial is the tip of the iceberg that I want to look at. I want to look at the iceberg from the 1920s. What was this controversy about science and religion involving? On our left, we see the very famous trial lawyer Clarence Darrow, a self-described agnostic who at times seems to be more of an atheist in the vigorous way in which he would attack religion, traditional religion of any kind. He loved to get into debates with people about things like, where did Cain get his wife? And was Jonah really swallowed by a whale? Did God really stop the earth from rotating at the long day of Joshua? Questions of this sort. They're the kinds of things that village atheists have liked to bait religious people with for a long time. And Darrow fit into that category. His father was a person of that mold back in his village in Ohio. He was also the most, probably the greatest trial lawyer of the 20th century, in the opinion of Edward Larson, the great legal historian who's written about this trial. On our right, we find William Jennings Bryan, a three-time Democratic candidate for President of the United States, a very, very liberal Democrat who was advocating women's suffrage, Philippine independence, the direct election of United States senators, public ownership of banks. He just didn't live long enough to see it. Issues of this kind. William Jennings Bryan was on the left wing of the Democratic Party, and he was also a Christian fundamentalist who took over leadership of the fundamentalist wing of the Presbyterian Church in the 1920s and narrowly lost an election for moderator of the General Assembly to the president of one of the Presbyterian colleges in Ohio. So this is the face-off that took place, the public face-off. Neither man had been invited to the Scopes trial. Both horned in on the business there. Bryan went to the prosecution, making them an offer that they felt politically they couldn't refuse, and Darrow went directly to John Scopes, offering to defend him, after he already had attorneys from the ACLU. So they both horned in on this and made a big affair out of it. But Bryan was well known at the time for trying to get laws passed by state legislatures banning the teaching of evolution in publicly funded schools. And the law that passed in Tennessee was not the only one that states contemplated. Dozens of states contemplated such laws, and it was not the only one to pass. But it was the first one to be brought to a test. And this occurred in the spring of 1925 when the Butler Act was signed into law by Governor Austin Peay in Tennessee. Governor Peay viewed this as a state of the legislature piece of legislation that would probably never need to be enforced. But the law made it illegal for any teacher in Tennessee, whether at the University of Tennessee or at a high school or at an elementary school, any publicly funded school in Tennessee, university on down, could not teach evolution or any other theory contrary to the biblical story of creation. That's what the law was about. Now, the background to that is that Bryan had joined up with a group of Christians calling themselves fundamentalists. And the word fundamentalist, as I'll tell you in a few moments, was not actually used until 1920. But the fundamentalists viewed themselves as engaged in a great culture war. And this particular image you're seeing, which comes from the King's Business, the King's Business was the official publication of the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, which is now called Biola University. This cartoon shows fundamentalists as they perceive themselves. This cartoon from 1927. There's battleships lined up, and the clarity here is a little lacking, but the images, each labeled, they're labeled culture, liberal theology. This one is modern thought, science, hypothesis, for which you can substitute the word evolution, and atheism. And these are all bombarding the Rock of Gibraltar, which of course is going to stand. But indeed, Bryan and the other fundamentalists of the 1920s perceived themselves to be under attack in a culture war. And it's that aspect of fundamentalism that's very important to understand the setting up of this Bible versus biology debate. The word fundamentalist originates in the context of culture wars. It was first used in print in July of 1920 by Curtis Laws, who was the editor of a Baptist weekly called the Watchman Examiner. And he had just returned from a Baptist convention. And he spoke about the need to identify themselves under a label of the group of those who still cling to the great fundamentals, is how he spoke of it. Now, of course, this is a direct reference to those particular doctrines that had been identified as the fundamentals in a series of pamphlets earlier in the decade. Things such as the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, also plenary verbal inspiration of the Scripture was part of this. And those who still cling to the great fundamentals and who mean to do battle royal for the fundamentals shall be called fundamentalists. It is this aspect of fundamentalism that is most clear in this controversy about science. What George Marsden, a prominent historian of fundamentalism, has called militant anti-modernism. Militant anti-modernism. The attitude here, not the content, but the attitude. Those who mean to do battle royal for the fundamentals. Now, William Jennings Bryan began his anti-evolution campaign early in the 1920s, and he was giving voice to ideas that were very widely shared by other American fundamentalists, including ideas about evolution. I'm going to review a number of these ideas from the 1920s through a series of images taken from cartoons drawn by the great fundamentalist cartoonist Ernest James Pace, who every week had a new cartoon in the Sunday School Times, which was a tabloid-style magazine sent weekly to between 60 and 100,000 subscribers during that decade. It would contain Sunday school lessons for teachers to use a week or two in advance. You could prepare. And it also contained news items of interest to American Christians. Nothing quite like it that I can think of having a wide circulation today, but it was sort of like a version of, a fundamentalist 1920s version of, say, Christianity Today or Christian Century or the old Eternity magazine, combined with these pedagogical things for teachers. You know, it was kind of a news and commentary plus these other things. And in the sort of news and commentary area, Pace would always draw a cartoon. They weren't usually about science, frankly. They were usually about living the Christian life in trying circumstances. But some of them were about science, and I'm going to show you several of those to see some of the points. One point you can see from this cartoon, which is from June 1922, shortly after Bryan's campaign gets off the ground, is the view of science, evolution as not legitimate science, which fundamentalists would have held in the 1920s, and fundamentalists today also hold. The view that evolution has never been adequately demonstrated. It's sheer speculation without proper grounding in the facts. And you can see that illustrated. The Darwinian hypothesis of evolution, it's always presented as a hypothesis in these cartoons, and hypothesis doesn't mean something which is well established. We'll come back to that shortly. In this case, it's beginning to fall down, it's leaking badly, and headed for Earth. It has been into cloudy speculation, and it's headed for a collision course now with the facts on the ground. And the gondola of this balloon is labeled "Science Falsely So-Called." Now, isn't that interesting? I don't need to tell a room full of Methodist pastors where that biblical reference is. It's in Paul's letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy, where that phrase, "science falsely so-called," which comes from the King James Version, that particular phrase has actually been used in America since just around 1800 as a phrase to mean unsupported speculative science. Now, it did not have that reference to evolution in around 1800. That wasn't on the table for conversation. But in the 1820s, it is used fairly often to mean modern geology in a non-evolutionary context. But in the 1920s, it's used all over the place to mean biological evolution. So this is science falsely so-called, unbiblical science, and we need to caution people against accepting that. Now here's a cartoon from England from the 1930s that gives voice to the same kinds of concerns that you find in America at the same time. The sacred pillar of evolution is built upon a whole set of hypotheses. It's just a pile of hypotheses culminating in this. And to understand the meaning of this, ultimately, we have to know what fundamentalists meant by the word hypothesis. Of course, it's a Greek word. And here's what Bryan said it meant. The word hypothesis is a synonym used by scientists for the word guess, okay? As in wild guess, unsupported guess, as you saw on the last slide, just speculation, nothing more than that. Or in the last statement, which he read outside the courtroom in Dayton in 1925, a week before his death, Bryan put it this way: evolution is not truth, it is merely an hypothesis. It is millions of guesses strung together. So evolution is guesses strung together. Brilliant illustration of it here in the 1930s. It's not science, in other words, in this view. It's not science, it's unsupportable speculation. Here's one of those cartoons that's not showing up as well as it ought to. But what we have here in this one is the view of public education that was being advanced by Bryan and the fundamentalists, in which we have the mortar board on top of the professor who's guiding the ship of popular education toward the rocks of infidelity, being blown there by the theory of evolution, while the student is ordered to throw the ballast overboard. The ballast is the Bible. Okay, so that's... Many Christians at the time saw evolution, and many Christians today still see evolution as a God-denying theory. Remember, theory means wild speculation. It doesn't mean legitimate science. It's a God-denying theory that contradicts the Bible. And in their view, this is one of Bryan's most important arguments, teaching evolution in public schools is a violation of the constitutional mandate of religious neutrality. Bryan did not think that Christianity should be taught in public schools. But he also thought that anti-Christianity shouldn't be taught in public schools either. And in his view, evolution was not science and it was anti-religious. So it shouldn't be taught in publicly funded schools. Private schools could do whatever they wished, but public schools shouldn't be doing this. Now, here's another example of this view of public education in which science, falsely so-called, is leading American school children down the path of education while this piper is playing the Darwinian hypothesis of evolution. And look where they're headed. Look where they're headed, okay? They're headed to a skull-shaped cave called disbelief in the God of the Bible. So that's a powerful imagery for getting a message across. Now, of course, in the 1920s, there was a lot of highway robbery going on. And what you have here is based on that fact that, as Pace comments down here, they jail men for this. And what you have in the classroom, in Pace's opinion, is an equivalent situation. Here you have the highwayman pointing his revolver at these innocent people who were driving on the highway. And here you have the professor pointing his revolver in the form of a diploma, science falsely so-called, at the head of the student who has to exchange her faith for this false science. And that, of course, is an unfair relationship. It's a form of highway robbery. Okay, now, the confrontational attitude of Bryan and others in the 1920s is still here. It's readily seen today. One of many examples I could offer, one that's perhaps very familiar here in this part of the United States, Ken Ham and his creationist ministry, Answers in Genesis. Notice one of Ham's early books from the 1980s is called The Lie, subtitle, Evolution. And of course, the imagery on the cover is quite clever. But here you have the Culture Wars piece very well shown. This is a more recent version of a cartoon that has of cartoon imagery that goes back a couple of decades on the part of the Answers in Genesis organization, in which you have the castle of humanism combating the castle of Christianity. And this one is founded on the idea of millions of years equaling man as authority. In earlier versions, this is directly founded on evolution, parenthesis, Satan. That's how it's put in earlier forms of this cartoon. So Satan is seen as the basis for evolution and humanism, which comes out of it. And on the other side, we have the castle of Christianity founded on a literal interpretation of Genesis. And these guys over here on this castle are shooting at the foundation, whereas these guys are clueless. And they're firing at the balloons that come out of humanism, these various social and moral ills, or in the wrong direction entirely, or this guy's about to take a shot at his fellow believer. And this guy's shooting at his own foundation. This is as much a commentary on forms of theistic evolution, in the opinion of Ham, than it is of anything else. But this culture wars context is very clear from the way in which things are presented today. Now, there's another form of anti-evolutionism today that is also fairly popular, and that is intelligent design. Now, that's not the same thing as scientific creationism. There's a number of fundamental differences that I won't have time to articulate today, but if you want to ask me why I would say they're fundamentally different, you can ask me about that while I'm here at the conference. I'd be glad to tell you my reasons for that. The creationist organizations often refer to themselves as scientific creationists, whereas the intelligent design people like to avoid that terminology as much as possible. In the case of creationism, for example, Ken Ham, who runs this museum nearby here, right? What's the name of the location? The little town. I visited this museum a few years ago, shortly after it opened. It's over near Cincinnati. And he has himself shown here with a dinosaur partly because it is his view, as is the view of other scientific creationists, that humans and dinosaurs coexisted for several thousand years after the creation of both humans and dinosaurs on the sixth day of creation. He has a major website that gets, I don't know how many hits every year. I'd be surprised if it's not hundreds of thousands or even millions of hits. An organization called Answers in Genesis, just answersingenesis.org. And I want to review for you the basic claims of scientific creationism. And then I'll do the same for intelligent design before providing some commentary at the end. To start with, let me say something about the Bible, since the theme of the talk is the Bible and biology. And scientific creationists would tell you that the Bible is the only truly reliable source of knowledge about the origin of the earth and the origin of the universe. Now, the logic here is very simple. No human person saw this. There were no witnesses for the creation except God, and God has told us what he did. So that's basically where this comes from in terms of a logic for the position. Indeed, how could there be a higher authority than the only eyewitness there was? God told us what he did, and no one else is in a position to pull rank on God on this issue. Now, following from this, creationists would argue that scientific evidence can be interpreted consistently with a six-day creation a few thousand years ago. The people who advanced this most forcefully were the late Henry Morris and John Whitcomb in their book, The Genesis Flood, which was published in 1961. I will have more to say about this book a little bit later. It was a combination, a combined effort on the part of Morris, who was a hydraulic engineer, and Whitcomb, who was an Old Testament scholar in the Grace Brethren tradition. He was at the Grace Seminary in Winona Lake, Indiana. But in terms of the sciences with which the creationists contend, it is not most of the results in chemistry or physiology or physics, including the kind of physics we use to put spacecraft into orbit. Rather, it is what are called the historical sciences. That is, those sciences that draw inferences in a forensic manner about the past of the earth and the universe. An example of this is geology. Another example would be paleontology, the study of fossils in a sequence historically, or evolutionary biology, or cosmology, the science of the whole universe. These are what we call historical sciences, because you can't do controlled laboratory experiments that reproduce past events. Rather, you have to infer what took place in the past from what you can get at in the present, in a manner analogous to that in which a prosecuting attorney in, say, a murder case for which there is no living witness other than perhaps the person in the defense box, who has to build a case that this person used this way of bringing about the death of this other person for this reason. In other words, they have to produce evidence that makes a compelling case that it's the best interpretation of what we do know. And that's the same kind of thing that happens in the historical sciences. And the historical sciences lack legitimacy, in the opinion of scientific creationists. Indeed, one of the most famous of the scientific creationists, who is a man from down under, Jonathan Sarfati, a former national chess champion in New Zealand, has written that it is, since the rise of uniformitarian science, by which he means modern geology, there have been many compromises of Scripture away from its original meaning. But this has had baneful effects on the authority and sufficiency of Scripture. It also undermines the sin, death, causality that underlies the gospel teaching that Jesus died for our sins. So, in the opinion of Sarfati and many other creationists, you can't separate the historical sciences from the gospel of Jesus. That if you're going to question, if you're going to accept the historical sciences and their conclusions about a lengthy earth history, you've undermined the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, a third point would be, in creationist opinion, the earth and the universe are very young. That is, not more than 10 to 12,000 years old at the most. and that all major kinds of living things were created separately over a 6-day period. And we came at the end, of course, human beings at the end of the 6-day period. Well, you might wonder, how old does mainstream science claim this is? Many of you probably know roughly how old, but just so we're on the same page with this, geology would put the age of the Earth as approximately 4.6 billion years, give or take a tenth of a billion years. What's a tenth of a billion years in this conversation anyway? And the universe would come in around 13.7 billion years old. So that the Earth, in other words, is thought to be about 1/3 of the age of the universe itself. Now, there's really no reconciling those numbers. This is, as scientists would say, magnitude 10 to the fourth. That is 10,000, a 1 followed by 4 zeros. Magnitude 10 to the fourth. These are magnitude 10 to the ninth and 10 to the 10th years. That's an enormous difference. It's not just a matter of 50%, 100%, huge difference. Someone here is very badly mistaken. You can't put these numbers together and get an agreement out of that. And creationists also believe that the Big Bang is a false theory that contradicts the Bible. As Answers in Genesis has it, they say this: when it was first proposed, the Big Bang was an attempt to explain how the universe could have been created without God. Really, it is an alternative to the Bible, so it makes no sense to try to add it to the Bible. And in their view, indeed, the Big Bang takes God out of the history of the universe and is an atheistic theory. This is all said despite the fact that the person who originated the Big Bang was a Belgian Jesuit priest, Georges Lemaitre, who was arguably the greatest cosmologist of the 20th century. And he even saw the implications of this and had to caution his own church. He cautioned the Pope not to make too much out of this because the science might change in the future. But it did seem to look like the universe had been created as a result of this theory. So this is an interesting way of reading the Big Bang. Creationists see alternative interpretations of the Bible as genuinely heretical. And you've already seen what was said about, what Sarfati said about the gospel and geology. But let me illustrate this in another way. The book you're looking at here is one of Sarfati's publications. It's called Refuting Compromise. Now, the subtitle of this book is what gets very interesting. He said it's called A Biblical and Scientific Refutation of Progressive Creationism. He puts the term in quotation marks, progressive creationism. Then he has parentheses, billions of years, as popularized by astronomer Hugh Ross. Now, many of you may recognize Hugh Ross. He is a Canadian astronomer who runs an apologetics ministry in Pasadena called Reasons to Believe. He's an old Earth creationist. He's not an evolutionist, but he thinks the universe and the Earth are billions of years old. He thinks the Big Bang is good science. He also thinks the Big Bang is powerful Christian apologetics, and he makes arguments on that basis. So an approach such as that taken by Hugh Ross is also compromise, and it's not acceptable in the opinion of scientific creationists. And the word compromise and accommodation are pejoratives in this particular context. Now, another view of scientific creationism is that the flood of Noah, was responsible for producing virtually all of the fossil rocks. And this occurred, of course, during human history. Now, there's a lot of things that come along with this that I won't go further with, but this view is called flood geology, the idea that the flood produced almost all the fossil-bearing rocks that we can find today. And that's on a collision course with natural history since the early 19th century. As I've already mentioned, according to creationists, humans and dinosaurs did coexist for thousands of years. They were created on the same day, after all, and they coexisted with us until some point after the flood. There were, in fact, dinosaurs on the ark, in the opinion of creationists. Finally, a theological point that many here will probably appreciate and understand very well. In my view, the factor that motivates the young Earth part of young Earth creationism more than anything else is theodicy. It's the issue that their belief that there could not have been suffering and death in the animal kingdom prior to the introduction of sin in the Garden of Eden. That it would have been unjust for God to allow suffering of animals prior to the sin on the part of Adam and Eve. And that means then that there could not be this long period of human history with all of these organisms coming into existence and going out of existence before we arrived on the scene. Thus, you must have a recent creation. And that's a key point for scientific creationists. There could not even have been any parasites, no disease organisms, and no carnivorous organisms either. So that T-Rex was an herbivore prior to the fall. Now, let me add a little bit of historical commentary. For about a century, from roughly around the time of the Civil War until the early 1960s, most conservative Protestant writers in this country accepted the validity of an old earth and an old universe. An example of this, a very nice example, they've held either a day age or gap view, and a very nice example of this would be the Scofield Reference Bible, which I'm sure you all know of, whether or not you've ever used one. And that was very widely used by conservative Protestants on both sides of the Atlantic after its publication in 1909. For a couple of generations, it might have been the Bible for the part of many conservative Protestants. That was it. Especially those Christians who actively attended Bible conferences in the summers, which is a large number of American Christians who would have done this, where these prophecy conferences where the Scofield Bible was the one that was in use. The Scofield Reference Bible actually favorably refers to both the gap theory and to the day-age view. It's a little bit confused about some of those details, kind of glosses them over in the extensive notes provided to the opening verses in Genesis. You can go and look at them yourself if you want some time and see what I mean by this. During that period of roughly a century, belief in a young earth and flood geology was prominent only in certain fringe groups. One of these especially was the Seventh-day Adventists. And Seventh-day Adventists were following their prophet Ellen White, who had had a vision in which she claimed to see the creation revealed to her. Here's how Ellen White put it. She said she was carried back to the creation and was shown that the first week in which God performed the work of creation in 6 days and rested on the seventh day was just like every other week. In other words, you couldn't interpret it as a long period of time. You had to take it literally. She also thought that the flood had been responsible for producing all the fossils. And those two pieces, among other things, were picked up by John C. Whitcomb, Jr., who is with Henry Morris, whom you see here. They are the authors of the Genesis Flood book that I mentioned a little while ago. Whitcomb did his doctoral dissertation during the 1950s at Winona Lake on the ideas of George McCready Price. And then he joined forces with engineer Henry Morris to write the Genesis Flood in the late 50s. It was published in 1961. You can see a reference to Price in their preface, but they greatly toned down the influence of Price on these ideas in this work, whereas in the dissertation it's abundantly clear that that's what's behind a lot of this. So this work popularizes the ideas of White and her follower, George McCready Price, in a very, very widely read book. This book's still in print. It's sold more than 250,000 copies, The Genesis Flood. Scientific creationism takes off from those views. Well, now what about intelligent design? You're looking here at the architect of the intelligent design movement, a man who is still living, though he is in failing health now, Philip Johnson, a retired professor of criminal law at the University of California, Berkeley, who in the 1960s, as a young attorney, was a clerk for Chief Justice Earl Warren of the Supreme Court. After going through a divorce and a conversion to evangelical Christianity, Johnson took a sabbatical in the United Kingdom where he read The Blind Watchmaker book by Richard Dawkins. someone I'll mention to you a little bit later. He also read a work critiquing Darwinian biology, a work by an Australian scientist called Michael Denton. And he was influenced by both of those pieces to write his own book, Darwin on Trial. Indeed, a lawyer's brief about evolutionary arguments that ultimately draws the Scottish verdict of not proved in the course of the book. He ultimately ends up with evolution as not proved, at least not to his satisfaction. He pulled together a number of young scientists and scholars from other fields into a movement during the 1990s. It goes under the umbrella name Intelligent Design. And the chief website for this is based in Seattle at the Discovery Institute, which is a political think tank that is not, in which intelligent design is not necessarily the main component. A number of other issues, including public transportation and some other matters of strictly more political and public policy issues, are the bailiwick, really, of the Discovery Institute. But they've become so well known because that's also where intelligent design finds its financial support. It's from this organization. Now, concerning intelligent design, what are those ideas? Well, let me say something about the Bible here as well. This may surprise some of you, but for the intelligent design folks, the Bible is not part of this conversation. This is a stark difference with scientific creationism, obviously. But the Bible is not part of this conversation, nor is theology or even the word God. Now, that's the official stance of the movement. Individual authors may talk about God, theology, even the Bible in some of their writings, but intelligent design, as intelligent design, brackets all of that. Now, why is that? Well, it's clearly part of a deliberate legal strategy. Remember the architect of the intelligent design movement was a Berkeley law professor. This is a deliberate legal strategy because of First Amendment issues in public education. In our legal system in America, we have a disestablishment of religion, whatever that may mean or not mean, according to given courts. What it does mean for sure, according to Supreme Court rulings from the 1980s, is that creationism, that is Ken Ham variety things, creationism cannot be taught in public school science classes. That creationism is not science, according to the Supreme Court. It is religion, sectarian religion, and cannot be taught in public school science classes. And proponents of intelligent design who do want to affect the way science is taught in public schools, therefore want to make sure that they are always keen to distance themselves from creationism, because then it will have no effect, ultimately, if intelligent design were ruled to be the same thing as creationism. A judge in Harrisburg made a ruling a few years ago that intelligent design is the progeny of creationism, which is pretty close. I'm not going to talk about that any further this morning. Philip Johnson himself even said at one point that the first thing you have to do is to get the Bible out of the discussion. And as he went on to say, this is not to say that biblical issues are unimportant. The point is, rather, that the time to address those issues will be after we have separated materialist prejudice from scientific fact. In Johnson's view, the theory of evolution is only able to be shown to be true if you automatically and arbitrarily exclude the possibility of intelligent design and divine creation. And that's what he means by materialist prejudice, as opposed to scientific fact. Now, advocates of intelligent design would say this then. They would not say that the flood produced all the fossils. They would not say the Earth is a few thousand years old. They would not say that humans and dinosaurs coexisted. They would not say that there was no death before the fall. But they would say this, that the universe itself and the objects that compose it, including galaxies and stars, which are not living things, exhibit abundant evidence of having been designed by an intelligent designer. That's what they would say. And therefore, they're not the products of blind chance. As I've said, these other biblical issues, such as these, for example, that we've already talked about in connection with creationism, those kinds of issues can be discussed later on, once the existence of an intelligent designer has been more widely accepted in the academic establishment. That's what they would say. In addition, because these theological issues are all bracketed, the intelligent design movement is a big tent. And that terminology is one that intelligent design advocates use themselves. They say, we are a big tent. And they mean not in a partisan political sense, obviously, but in a political sense more broadly, that they're content to work with lots of people who have diverse views on these theological issues to unify around opposition to materialism, which is often equated with evolution. And for the time being, at least, they're content to overlook major theological differences among adherents. And it is the case, it's a fact that not all intelligent design proponents are Christians, and at least a few are not even theists. So it should be clear to you at this point, with these big differences, that intelligent design is not creationism. But the tone of intelligent design does resemble the tone of creationism when it comes to cultural issues. I could say a lot about this. I don't have time. I'll say just a little bit. But let me offer support for this claim by quoting the leading intelligent design thinker today, Bill Dembski. And here's what Dembski wrote in the preface to a book printed after the Dover trial that was designed as a Festschrift, a book to honor Philip Johnson. It's called Darwin's Nemesis. And in the preface to that, here's what Dembski wrote. He said, because of Kitzmiller versus Dover, school boards and state legislators may tread more cautiously, but tread on evolution they will. The culture war demands it. So it's, when you have leading proponents of intelligent design who deliberately and often, repeatedly, connect themselves with culture wars, then it becomes very hard for people to separate the culture wars component from any claims about philosophy or science that are being made. Okay, now let me move to the third of the big questions now. Does evolution deny Orthodox Christianity? And for this one, I want to come right back to William Jennings Bryan again. Here's a cartoon by Pace, where the message is pretty clear, isn't it? And here's what Bryan said about theistic evolution, which was a term that goes back in American usage to at least the 1870s. But it was widely used in the 1920s. Bryan, of course, using it to describe a view he utterly rejected. Theistic evolution is, he said, an anesthetic which deadens the pain while the patient's religion is being gradually removed. He also said it was a way station on the highway that leads from Christian faith to no-God land. Well, let me show you that highway, because Bryan described it in a cartoon that Pace carried out, in this, not in the Sunday School Times in this case, but became the frontispiece to Bryan's book, 7 Questions in Dispute, published the year before the Scopes trial. Here you have it. Bryan described this cartoon in a letter he wrote to the editor of the Sunday School Times, a letter that is in the Library of Congress today. And here's what Bryan said. He said, the cartoon would depict evolution as I believe it to be, namely as the cause of modernism. He meant theological modernism, as in fundamentalists versus modernists, the cause of modernism, and the progressive elimination of the vital truths of the Bible. So evolution, in Bryan's view, was responsible for all of this staircase. He said it would be a staircase on which there is no stopping place, i.e., a slippery slope. And at the top of the staircase, you would have a student stepping from the Bible, not infallible, to man not made in God's image. Halfway down, you'd have a minister with a Bible in his hands, stepping from no deity, as in no deity of Jesus, is what that meant. No deity of Jesus to no atonement. And at the bottom, a scientist stepping from agnosticism to atheism. So in Bryan's view, the acceptance of evolution led in just a clear line all the way to atheism. And as he said, there was a staircase on which there's no stopping place. So that's the question here. If a person accepts evolution, does that lead to these other steps on the staircase? It's a good question. Oh, boy. Well, I'm just going to skip that one. Let me let me now introduce you to some modern voices in the conversation and ask this larger question. Do indeed these other steps in the staircase follow from the acceptance of evolution? Well, here's someone who would say they certainly do. And the person who would say that is Richard Dawkins, the leading voice of the so-called new atheists, people like Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens are other authors in this category. These are people who believe that the acceptance of evolution specifically and modern science more generally both lead, more or less inevitably, to a rejection of any God in the universe. Richard Dawkins, one of his most recent books on this, The God Delusion, is kind of a frontal attack on all kinds of traditional religion, all of which are bad in his view. Religion, in general, in his view, is a virus that we need to eradicate. And science is a useful tool for doing that. It will help eradicate religion in the modern world. Here's a religious voice whose conclusions, frankly, in my view, are not all too dissimilar from those of Richard Dawkins, and that's Bishop John Spong, who indeed argues that Christians, because of science, Christians need to go beyond theism, right? Beyond theism, and beyond belief in heaven and hell, if you will, beyond belief in an eschatological kingdom to come, beyond belief in a creator God, beyond belief in the deity of Jesus. But here's a very different voice in the conversation. Here we're looking at Francis Collins, who is the head of the Human Genome Project for many years, and is now the head of the National Institutes of Health. He was appointed head of the National Institutes of Health by President Obama early in the administration and confirmed unanimously by the Senate. This was not a controversial appointment that the president made. And Dr. Collins has written a book about his views on evolution and theology called The Language of God. Currently, the cover is this clever combination of the DNA molecule with the rosary, even though Collins is not a Catholic. He is an evangelical Christian who was, in his own words, during his days as a resident in medicine at the University of North Carolina, when he was in his 20s, in his own words, he was an obnoxious atheist. That's how he describes himself now. You know, I would hesitate to say I have some friends who are atheists who are not obnoxious, and I know some obnoxious people who aren't atheists. But Dr. Collins said he himself was an obnoxious atheist, and he was converted to evangelical Christianity after responding to work by C.S. Lewis and the challenge of a Methodist minister, whom he spoke to about these issues. He was challenged by his own patients who were terminally ill, who would talk about the meaning of life, and they would ask Dr. Collins what he thinks, and he didn't have an answer. And so he began to wrestle with questions like this. But he presents a case for this, and he's a geneticist. After he became a Christian, not one idea he had in genetics changed as a result of his conversion, but the way he viewed the relationship between science and religion, of course, changed fundamentally. Collins has even written in this book that the genetic evidence for common ancestry, the idea that humans and other organisms have common biological ancestors, is so strong that Darwin wouldn't have needed anything else to argue the case for evolution had he had that evidence, which he didn't, because the evidence Collins is speaking about comes out of the Human Genome Project, which is a modern project. Or take the views of John Polkinghorne, an English particle physicist, a fellow of the Royal Society, who, in his book, The Faith of a Physicist, professes the Nicene Creed without crossing his fingers. This is a very traditional theologian on these issues, and yet he fully accepts the modern scientific picture to which he has contributed substantially himself. In his case, it was to the mathematics underlying quark theory back in the 1950s and 60s. Mid-career, Polkinghorne gave up his position at Cambridge, the most distinguished physics department in England, where his colleagues included people like Stephen Hawking, in order to enter the Anglican ministry. Went to seminary, became a parish priest, and has subsequently written 30 or more books on science and Christianity. From in some ways, a non-traditional theological perspective on certain points. For example, Polkinghorne is attracted to open theism. On the other hand, on issues related to the ecumenical creeds, he's very, very traditional. Or someone like Robert Russell, another physicist who's the head of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. He's a classical Trinitarian Christian, and he writes about Trinitarian theology and modern science in many of his works, including this recent one, which is a very high-level book, difficult to sit down and read, but when you do work through it, there's much there to appreciate. His book, Cosmology from Alpha to Omega. Now, to wrap this up, I should point this out, that theologically, some advocates of theistic evolution have advanced, interestingly enough, a very strongly Christocentric theology of creation, or incarnational theology of creation, which classically, of course, as you probably all know, you don't find much of this. It's almost always put in terms, classically in Christian thinking, of God the Creator as God the Father, not God the Son, as the prologue to John's Gospel would have it. But many of these advocates of theistic evolution today speak Christocentrically about creation, stressing the idea that the maker of heaven and earth is the crucified and resurrected second person of the Trinity, which may help, indeed, thinking about issues about theodicy in relation to evolution. You know, I can't flesh that out here in the time I have, but you can see where that might go. They like to speak about the crucified God using Jürgen Moltmann's language, or the theology of the cross using the language of Lutheran theologian George Murphy, ultimately taken from Luther, or divine kenosis. And similarly, those in this camp often emphasize what they call theology of nature more than natural theology. Some theistic evolutionists still talk about natural theology, but usually they approach this more modestly. An example of this, again, is John Polkinghorne, whose book, Belief in God in an Age of Science, is the Terry Lectures from Yale from the mid-1990s. And here's how Polkinghorne in that book takes this attitude toward natural theology. Theism can't be proved from nature in the old-fashioned Thomas Aquinas sense, but theism still makes more sense of our whole experience of the world than atheism does. So it's a more modest form of natural theology than you used to find. My final example is Harvard astronomer and historian Owen Gingerich, whom I understand spoke to you last year at your conference, right? Whose book, God's Universe, you may be familiar with from that work. He's also a traditional Christian on these issues of the ecumenical creeds, and he gives voice to that in the final parts of God's Universe. So where does that leave us? And this is where I'm going to be wrapping it up. So for many American Christians, however, the ideas I've just presented to you here at the end by people like Collins and Polkinghorne and Gingerich are really no more acceptable than those of Dawkins. I mean, think of the attitude we saw on the part of Sarfati on his book, for example, Refuting Compromise. Nevertheless, they do represent a new feature on the historical landscape. These are world-class scientists and theologians who not only accept evolution, but also affirm the incarnation and the bodily resurrection of Jesus. They have not taken those steps down that slippery slope of William Jennings Bryan's. And there wasn't anyone like them in the 1920s. You can't find people like this. You can find world-class scientists and theologians who didn't believe in the bodily resurrection and the incarnation. They're a dime a dozen. You could also find fundamentalists who rejected the evolution. They're also a dime a dozen. But you couldn't find people like this. Now, are they going to make a difference in the conversation? Well, you're asking the wrong person. I'm a historian, not a prophet. I can't tell you how this is going to play out. But thanks for your attention.
Well, thank you, Dr. Davis. You'll notice that we have a 30-minute break. The participants in last year's conference encouraged us to build in longer breaks. What they loved about the conference was the high quality of the content, but they told us that we all together needed more time to process what we were hearing. And so we have longer breaks that give you opportunities then to approach the speakers and talk with them more, to ask about recommended reading if you're interested in further study and exploration, and to talk with each other. So we're going to take a 30-minute break. We're going to resume a few minutes before 11, and I'll be introducing Dr. Phil Meadows. One more note. Some of you have asked about today being Ash Wednesday. The next session will run until 11 o'clock, at which time we will break for lunch. At 11 o'clock, there will be an Ash Wednesday service in Estes Chapel for the entire seminary community, and you're certainly invited to participate in that service if you would like. So let's take a break, and we'll return and resume a few minutes before 10 o'clock.